this is really, I think, a very preliminary lecture, and I think a very heterodox reading. And my title is Humility and Limitation, Cassirer on Kant, Goethe, and Others on Life, Organism, and Ethics. My task for this lecture is to take someone like Cassirer, who is viewed in a lot of the literature on intellectual history as part of this kind of conservative liberal tradition in political theory, and is embodying a kind of analytical tradition in philosophy in the 20th century. This famous sort of face-off between Cassirer and Heidegger. And I think this is helpful, but also a little bit reductionist. And I want to attach Cassirer in a at least an initial way of a specific series of thinkers, sometimes called neo-Kantian, who are thinking seriously about organic life, the problem of the organic, and about considering Cassirer in terms of a series of very interesting Kantian legacies, and thinking about this so-called problem of the organic, the focus on the organic, on living nature, and what it carries with it in terms of an account of politics and an account of ethics, and the proper limitations of politics and ethics that we should pay attention to. So some initial notes on Ernst Cassirer. He was born in 1874 and died in 1945. He was one of these peripatetic or sort of hopping around scholars because of the horrors of Nazism, and fled to a series of positions, finally ending up at Columbia University, where he passed away suddenly on a street corner, right actually across the street from one of the main entrances. So he studied under Hermann Cohen and Paul Nathrop, and with the mathematician Schottky, who actually the mathematician Schottky was known for his work on elliptical functions, and a lot of Cassirer's work throughout his career has a kind of sort of very mathematical flavor to it that's very interesting. In his early career, he wrote on Leibniz, who Cassirer considered to be kind of a precursor to Kant. And increasingly, he wrote on myth and culture, and is considered, I don't think this is precisely my term, but I'm going to emphasize it. So there's an anthropological turn in Cassirer's work, as opposed to an epistemological turn in a lot of the other work of the period, which is he's really focusing on philosophical anthropology, on the structure of human experience as mediated by a body. I interpret Cassirer a little bit through Hans Blumenberg, where a lot of what Blumenberg says in terms of how we construct reality is also sort of based in our biology, and I think Cassirer at points gets there. I'm not going to be able to talk too much about that in this lecture. He's often classified, so Cassirer is often classified as a so-called Marburg neo-Kantianism, because of where he did his studies and who he studied with. I think these labels are quite misleading sometimes. It's unclear for many neo-Kantians how much they consider themselves to be in schools. I think some of the schools can be very detailed. I think putting people into schools is a little bit artificial, but it's sometimes useful, and it's sometimes useful for Cassirer. So for Cassirer's neo-Kantianism, so-called, This includes rejection of Kantian dualism between appearances and things in themselves, and neo-Kantians in general, and I think they all agreed on this, sought primarily to go beyond Kant. What that means sort of depends on who's writing. And as I said initially, I'm really more interested in how neo-Kantians here became frustrated with Kant's account of reason, nature, reason, physics, and biology, and especially sought to understand Kant's account of organic nature and the degree to which it interacted with Kant and others' account of ethics and of values. Oh, that was not what I intended. Okay. So some more notes on Cassirer. He displayed differences. So on my right, you have Cassirer's obituary, which ran in the New York Times. And it interestingly says where he passed away, and also that I'm not sure if you can see this, but it also pointed out that he completed over 100 books and articles, many of which are actually, I think, still released kind of in archive form. But Cassirer displayed many differences with Hermann Cohen, and actually there was a very complicated break between the two of them. And he also mentored a number of students, one of whom was Leo Strauss. Cassirer's own ethical and political commitments emphasized a kind of a phenomenology of philosophic spirit of the Enlightenment. And I think this actually starts to get to some of the core ideas of his philosophy, and also why necessarily thinking about Cassirer and this kind of synthetic analytic divide or the continental analytic divide is not necessarily all that helpful, because in many ways his account of the Enlightenment, as I'll point out, is very much something which resembles a kind of a Hegelian framework or a more continental flavor. So Cassirer says, and also in his account of the Enlightenment, he starts talking about life and vitality, and this goes to my point of thinking about Cassirer in a little bit of a different way of having the organic and the vital kind of at center of his inquiry. So Cassirer says that the philosophy of the Enlightenment, rather than a specific science, was, quote, the totality of intellect in its true function, the specific character of its investigations, its methods, and its cognitive processes. So, end quote. The Enlightenment, Cassirer continued, turns the fixed problems and concepts of philosophy and transforms them into, quote unquote, active forces, or from bare results into imperatives, unquote. So it's this idea that the Enlightenment is sort of activating thought. It's activating philosophy in the world. Cassirer, incidentally, in this same passage, approves very strongly of Hegel's phenomenology, and starts saying that one of the really important discussions of philosophy, and one of the dangers of philosophy, is that philosophy too much often has a kind of analytic function. Analytic is his phrase, and that philosophy becomes a kind of dissecting. And that is Cassirer's phrase as well. So philosophy should not dissect overly, should not be too sort of breaking apart things. Rather, its philosophy should bring about the order of things which it conceives as necessary. That's a quote from Cassirer. And philosophy, quote, has the power and task of imitating life itself. So Cassirer notes this in his preface to the Philosophy of the Enlightenment, which the English translation was published in 19 51. So, as I said again, interpretively, I'm skeptical of this kind of parting of the ways of philosophy in the 20th century and between kind of this rationality liberalism and irrationality fascism kind of divide. And as I said before, Cassirer sounds kind of remarkably continental, where I think enlisting him as a kind of post-war emigre philosopher aligned against irrationalism like Arendt and Popper and Strauss and Vogelin, I think is unwise. And I think it certainly, reduces the complexity of his thought. Cassirer and Natrop also in the same vein. Natrop is another neo-Kantian philosopher who was close to Cassirer, believed that the primordial self, the organic self, is not rationally constituted. And according to the eminent Cohen scholar, who also is very, very good on Cassirer, Stephen Schwarzschild, who also was a rabbi, for Cassirer, the world is experienced as an organic, mythic whole that is, quote, anthropomorphically and animistically constituted, where with experience there is, according to Cassirer, a quote, a kind of experience of reality which is situated wholly outside of the form of scientific explanation and interpretation. Here, Cassirer, I think, as I mentioned before, is a great deal like Hans Blumenberg. Blumenberg is a very difficult philosopher to categorize. He worked a great deal in one of my interests in philosophical anthropology, where he developed a kind of philosophical framework, both pointing to, in the terms of the history of science, why certain historical questions are answered at specific times, and also drawing from the whole history kind of continental letters in particular, figuring out why individuals rely so much and communities rely so much on myth. And from one of his mentors, Arnold Galen, I think he was an unofficial mentor, Blumenberg really develops, like Cassirer, this kind of bodily, quasi-biological account, quasi-physiological account of not only the reason that myth is important, but why it is physiologically and evolutionarily makes sense for myth to be so. So in the same way, and Blumenberg addresses Cassirer's writings a great deal, but they are actually, so Cassirer passes away really at the same time that they're of different generations. So Blumenberg passed away, I believe, in 1996. But there's a conceptual continuity between the two that is, I think, generational. So for Cassirer, going back to him, beings and our being are not mere appearances, but as Cassirer says in the philosophy of symbolic form, our realities, our quote unquote realities, they are beings, are living subjects. And to step out again, this whole account of life and of living and of thinking about organic things and what is the status of life and what should it mean for sort of ethics and politics. This is a very kind of normal thing in neo-Kantian philosophy. So a very important, I think, neglected Spanish, now it may not be neglected in this room, but I think neglected generally. I don't want to make any assumptions. So the Spanish neo-Kantian Manuel Morente, under the influence of Cassirer, Cohen, and Natrop, believed that unlike quote unquote values, life is a quote unquote independent entity. And for Morente, life is really the only thing that we encounter that is absolute, authentic, where the values in life are real objects. And this is, according to Morente, very different than even ethics, because ethics is a relation to something, while life is autonomous and separate and doesn't have to be related to anything. Life is the thing that everything is related to. We encounter things only in life, where there is, for Morente, no sort of prior category or primordial category before that, where if we were to do anything to life to reduce it out of its autonomous state, it becomes a mere object or a mere value. And what was needed was a new logic of life. And this is very similar. And Morente is writing around the same time as Cassirer, and what he has in mind is a kind of the vital logic of Goethe and the Meditations on Don Quixote, written in 1914, which Morente believes actually predates, anticipates Heidegger in many ways. So it's an interesting kind of digression that I don't want to spend too much time digressing on. So why all of this focus on the organic, on life? This is because everyone that was a so-called neo-Kantian philosopher was talking about life and talking about the problem of the organic. And very arguably, and I say this very arguably because I'm not really a scholar of neo-Kantian philosophy. I'm just sort of a gadfly, or somebody who makes sort of provocative statements. I'm no expert. So I say that this is one of the most important questions in the philosophical literature. And I think it's a very important question also, too, given how much time and how much very good energy has been spent on Kant's account of biology, Kant's account of teleology and the living organism. So one of the real representatives of this kind of, I would almost say, tradition of inquiry, of going into the organic, looking at the organic, is Bruno Bauch, who again is an incredibly important philosopher because he considered, he spent a lot of time writing about the difficulties of Kant's view of material in the cosmos, but also really trying to build out Kant's account of nature in the third critique on organic life. Bauch considered Kant's great contribution to be the quote unquote problem of the organic, or the study of the organism as both means and ends and means. And for Bauch, we think of the organic as something distinct from the inorganic because of its special features. And this is also where I should say Bauch is known to 20th century philosophy mostly for two elements. One, being Carnap's advisor, and two, being a virulent anti-Semite. So he embraced the Nazi regime and was basically sort of exiled from the Kant philosophical fraternity, and he sort of passed away in obscurity. But Bauch paraphrased another philosopher, Otto Liebmann, by noting that only in the organic, only in the context of the organism do we understand, and this is Bauch speaking here, so quote, every part serves the whole, and the whole serves every part. So not only is the whole related to its part, but no part is unrelated to the whole and to its other parts. So Bauch underscores this in his 1917 book on Kant. And you can see this kind of, this is a very interesting, very clear account of holism that comes out of Kant's philosophy. And you can see this account of holism kind of populating in the interwar and post-war philosophical environment, specifically in this formulation. So when we say this, there's holism or organicism, maybe it comes from this too. I don't want to stress that too much. So according to Bauch, the individual in the context of the organism expresses a very specific, unique relationship. So an individual, as an individual, if that as an organic individual, is an indivisible unity. And what I think is most interesting about Bauch is he is a philosophical person. He's not doing any experiments, but he's relying on Driesch, on Hertwig, Richard Hertwig, and other zoologists who are doing experimental work. So he's reading experimental physiology and biology and embryology and getting from this account of individuality, which is based on Kant's account of nature and the organic and the organism, but also is increasingly informed by a lot of actual experimental work. So Bauch is sort of an intermediate figure in that way, and two very interesting. So for Bauch, the individual, quote, expresses the specifically organic interrelationship and the interconnection of the organs in the organism, in the structure of which all parts are mutually dependent. So for Bauch, and I think for others, unlike inorganic non-living matter, the organism has a specifically denoted property, which is the correlation of the parts. And here he's drawing on the zoologist Richard Hertwig, while underscoring that in organic unity there is unlike totally inorganic, with inorganic matter, like stones, for example, you can rearrange the stones in any shape or form you want, but you can't do that with physiological elements. The system will go out of equilibrium. And Bauch is importantly denoting this very strongly about from Kant why organic life is so different. So for another important person is Driesch in this debate. So Driesch, I think people know, was profoundly influenced by Kant, and he profoundly influenced Bauch. So Driesch is known as kind of sort of this vitalist thinker, but and that's of course true. I'm not saying anything about that, which says actually, I'm not saying that Driesch was secretly not a vitalist. I'm saying I'm not really attempting to reformulate Driesch. I'm simply saying that Driesch was deeply influenced by Kant, and actually many people were influenced by Driesch outside of the discussion of vitalism, that Driesch has many more things going on in his work. And thinking about this whole debate too is a little bit of a heuristic. So I'm using this discussion to not only present a kind of loose argument, but actually saying, well, if you trace this idea, you actually can look at philosophers a bit and scientists and researchers a bit differently, to take them out of their sort of historiographic little areas. So Driesch, who significantly influenced Bauch, and also believed the so-called problem of the organic to be among the most important, if not the most important aspect of Kantianism and Kant's work. I know I'm using the two interchangeably, and I shouldn't, but okay. For Driesch, as for Bauch, life had a so-called quote unquote inner principle of determining its own activity, of moving from a state of motion or rest, and that unlike non-organic forms, there can be no total explanation, according to Driesch, of the organic, that individual life cannot be explained due to the, as Driesch puts it, the infinite multiplicity of particular laws of motion. So for Driesch, interestingly, you can say that Driesch, similarly to Cassirer, underscores that organic life denotes the limits of reason, and perhaps this hints at an ethical or political dimension of the desirability of limitations, right? So no utopian schemes, right? No relentlessly sort of divorce systems which take apart and destroy and impose. This is why Goethe also becomes important in the next slide. So we now finally go back to Cassirer through Goethe. So for Cassirer, and I think this has been mentioned in the scholarship, that Goethe is very important for Cassirer, but also Kant is very important for Goethe. So for Cassirer, who kind of mediates his thinking through Goethe, Goethe is Kantian, is quote unquote Kantian, but he goes sort of beyond Kant, right? And in this way, Cassirer notes approvingly that Goethe says that laws and classes only contain or relate organic forms, but they can't actually describe or encapsulate organic forms, right? You can classify things under, sort of the systems of laws, and you can sort of look at their relationships, but that really only gets at one side of what is the nature of life. It really doesn't accurately describe them, and it really doesn't encapsulate them. So when you're thinking about the laws of life or the laws of nature, you're thinking just about one aspect of it. And that's a limited aspect. Goethe doesn't think that aspect is totally unhelpful. He just says that, you need to go and think about it in a different way. And I think Cassirer definitely approves of this. So Cassirer also approves of Goethe's account of metamorphosis as going beyond, quote unquote, mere relations into quote unquote intuitive forms. So Goethe in this instance noted, quote, only the last, that what you wanted to avoid is a scenario in which only, quote, the last formless sublimated abstraction is left, and the subtlest organic life is joined to the completely formless and bloodless universal phenomenon of nature. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to sort of abstract things and make things so under sort of overgeneralized that you can't really understand everything in its individuality. So when Kant goes to the principles of human understanding, Goethe, Cassirer argues, looks more for the productive principles of nature, right? So this actually goes back to Cassirer saying he's really interested in the work of reason, the work of philosophy, the living things, the vital forces, things in activity. And I think he gets this from Goethe. So for Goethe and for Kant, Cassirer believes that one of the greatest pleasures of philosophy and of thought itself is to, quote, inquire into what can be known and to reserve in silence what cannot be known. So there's a way in which reason is helpful, and there's a way in which reason is unhelpful. And reason is a little bit unhelpful when it comes to organic life. So, Goethe also, Cassirer notes, approvingly rejects this abstract mechanical model. And I think this is broadly similar to this kind of rejection of kind of this bloodless mathematical account of nature. You see this in Arendt, in particular, where what is really needed is something which understands, but just doesn't dissect and doesn't sort of try to over-explain, or explains things that are in their domain-specific appropriate ways. And you can see other philosophers like Hans Jonas in the post-war period really trying to get to this fundamental question. So for Goethe also, according to Cassirer, there is an aversion, right? A quote unquote aversion to any kind of quote unquote formless abstraction. And this is Goethe speaking, but this is Goethe speaking and Cassirer approving. And for Cassirer, this really reflects a lot of Kant's insights, particularly in the third critique. So I'm running a little bit short on time, I think. So I just want to say, well, let's start thinking about this towards ethics, right? So if Kant was interested in the so-called principles of empirical knowledge, Goethe preferred, especially in the account of nature, to inquire into so-called ultimate phenomenon. That there are necessary limits to nature does not deter Goethe and does not deter Cassirer, where to know everything, especially in the organic space, and I think also for Cassirer in the anthropological space, in the mythic space, in the political space, this would be a kind of anathema, where Goethe is at pains to say that everything in the physical world is in a fixed place, in a definite system. Not so with art, and not so with the kind of natural living world. Nature, like genius for Goethe, and I think also for Cassirer, is something which really requires innateness. It requires something which is really kind of given, and you could even say, almost primordially given. It's really constituting, and it's something that it cannot be taught, cannot be learned. It requires complete understanding, analysis. It's active, it's vital, going back to Cassirer's initial language. So I'm arguing that this inquiry into organic nature as the inquiry into morals, ethics, and conduct from organic nature itself is, according to Cassirer, the real position you should take here in science and ethics and politics is quote unquote humility and limitation. This is sort of Goethe talking, Cassirer talking through Goethe. And kind of but suffused with a kind of optimism, because Goethe and Cassirer both think that pessimism, particularly skeptical pessimism, is incredibly problematic. And I think also they would say, kind of, nihilism, or any kind of this idea that either you can know nothing or that nothing matters. And it's sort of this alienated, vicious consciousness is not something. So there is a kind of optimism whereby you can't know everything, but you can know some things, and knowing some things rather than nothing is good for ethics, and it's good for politics. So this humility adapted to politics and morals in Goethe and Cassirer and Kant and some of the neo-Kantians rejects totalizing skepticism, pessimism, and nihilism through recourse to the specific and unique characteristics of the organic, to life, to the problem of the organic. This is a way of thinking about science, but also thinking about a foundational theory of politics and human action. So for Goethe and the neo-Kantians, the very livingness of organic phenomena resisted the very kind of thinking which for Cassirer and for others was totalizing and abstract, where, sort of this kind of, in the same thing of this, I think everyone is reacting in some way to this idea of the French Revolution imposing a kind of rationalism on politics and a utopianism, which in essence that abstracts everything and everyone, and then brings about this totalizing sort of epoch-making phenomenon. So this kind of maximalism is epistemologically in recourse to the organic life to be avoided. So for all of these thinkers, limited judgment given by the example of the inquiry into the forms of the organic was for Goethe so-called mature judgment. And it may be that this self-imposed limitation, this optimism, this humility, this boundedness, this idea that things could be learned, but not completely, that you should try, but not try things sort of too much. All of this could certainly lead to a kind of mature politics. So here I end, I think. So thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions.
Okay, Chris, thanks very much. You were on time.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. Questions. The first question will be, take a lucky guess, Chris.
You can sit here.
Which?
Whoever wants to ask a question can sit.
It feels like defending a PhD.
Yeah.
It happens again and again and again. Thank you, Chris. Very rich talk, as they say. I have a question. I gave a primarily Uexküll-focused talk yesterday, and I had a very short quote from Cassirer. And my question is, does Cassirer do something with Uexküll? Well, A, does Cassirer do something really with Uexküll? And more precisely, B, does he do something with Uexküll as Kantian? Because Uexküll, in an idiosyncratic way, perhaps, clearly considers himself a kind of Kantian too. Possibly he gets it from the kinds of people you were talking about, but I don't know more than that. So, have anything to say about Cassirer, Uexküll, and Kant?
Not really, because that's a really good question. I have to I actually I need to look at your paper and then I'll get back to you on that. But that's a really good
Sorry for a bad question.
No, it's a really good question because I can't answer it off the top of my head. That's the best question, actually.
Yes, Charles told me what he's going to ask you, and if we took a bet, I would lose now because I said that you're definitely going to be able to say a lot on this topic.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah, you have to write that paper.
I'd have to write that paper.
First, yeah, cool.
Hey, Chris, thank you so much for the very interesting and rich talk, as Charles said. So, in the volume that you edited with Charles, Masvita Chirimuta has a chapter where she argues that Cassirer's fondness of holisms and his rejection of vitalism is related to trying to be against Bergson and other forms of Lebensphilosophie. So I'm wondering if this also played a role in the Goethean reading of Cassirer. More, I don't know, I'm feeling also like a holistic vibe there. So is this also related to how he sees Goethe?
Yeah, I think so. I think that this my account of Cassirer in this way sort of reinforces her account. I think it in the case of Cassirer, it kind of puts more of an underpinning to why, and the roots of why, and connects precisely that critique to a broader foundation. So I think our work is very complementary in that specific way.
Oh yeah. Can I make another question?
Yeah.
A quick one. And I know you said explicitly that you're not an expert in neo-Kantianism, but have you encountered other neo-Kantians interpreting Goethe in a similar vein to Cassirer, or they had diverging interpretations of Cassirer besides the ethical consequences?
Yeah. So this is where I think my bigger project is the so-called problem of the organic, where everyone decides that the so-called problem of the organic is the problem to solve, and essentially marshals the entire sort of post-Kantian position of philosophy to solve this problem. So there's a real way in which Goethe is, I think, similarly mobilized. Where people start discovering Goethe and other philosophers, and is really outside of like a specific tradition. So it's not like and it's outside of a very it's much less adversarial, I would say. So instead of thinking of all of these people as arguing with one another, they're all saying, well, what does Goethe have to say about organic life? What does Goethe have to say about geology? What does Goethe have to say? Does Goethe give any insight into sort of helping us unfold this problem of the third critique? And of this, how should we think of Kant and teleology? So Goethe is kind of, there are many others, but Goethe is one of the people who is marshaled by other philosophers in a similar way, to where all of a sudden there becomes this kind of reservoir where you attack this very important Kantian problem. So this is the kind of one of the projects that I'm working on, where the more important thing too is how does Goethe sort of interact between this very nascent division at the time between kind of philosophical life sciences, even though they're not called that, and experimental life sciences, and how those two sides are interacting. And Goethe is also sort of marshaled in his account too of scientific method. And so it's an endlessly fascinating exchange. I just really wish I could answer off the top of my head Charles's question. Now it's really going to bother me. Uh, but I hope that answers your question a
Oh
little bit.
yeah, fascinating. Thank you very much.
Okay, Chris, we have another question. And then,
Is it okay to sit here?
yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, thank you so much for this deep dive into German, how can we call it, cultural philosophy of the symbolic, which broke off after Second World War. And so Cassirer's death was very somehow significant for this. And
Yeah.
just a little answer, he openly works with Uexküll in his essay on man. And he uses Uexküll semiotics as a base for that version of his philosophy of symbols in the essay on man. So that's and Cassirer has a very interesting idea of symbol of the archetype of the symbol, Ursymbol, which builds actually on Goethe, on the Urphänomen, on the primordial phenomenon, which in itself is explanation and experience. And what I want to, it's less a question than a little comment, which refers to the discussion we had in this conference, that because I'm the man here who always reiterates that we need to go back to our lived experience if we want to talk about life. And that's what Goethe never lost, and what also Hans Jonas did. And you can see, I think it is clear to see the connection in, let's say, this vein of German thinking tradition. And when Hans Jonas talks about the life saying yes to itself, that it has to do with this Goethean approach that there is something which can be an explanation and an experience at the same time. And Cassirer is very close to this. And I don't want to stop now, because I want to read you two little quotes, which also bring something together. I want to read you the quote of famous Goethe's quote about the phenomena and the blue sky. And then I want to read you the famous quote of Merleau-Ponty. He's also talking about the blue sky. And these are very, very similar. So Goethe says, the highest is to understand that all fact is really theory. The blue of the sky reveals to us the basic law of color. Search nothing beyond the phenomena. They themselves are the theory. So that's still very enigmatic, actually. And it's also very experiential. And Merleau-Ponty says in his late book, the Eye and the Mind, I think, in one of the essays, as I contemplate the blue of the sky, I abandon myself to it and plunge into this mystery. It thinks itself within me. I am the sky itself as it is drawn together and unified, and as it begins to exist for itself, my consciousness is saturated with this limitless blue. I mean, interesting connections, I'd say.
Yeah, I think, and this I think goes, and that's helpful because it's also an articulation in a little bit of a different forum, some of the main themes that I'm getting to, which I'm thankful for. So it's a nice cap of some of my contentions, which I think are from my perspective, what's very interesting is this Cassirer's rehabilitation of Goethe as somebody you should take very, very seriously, even on something as very basic as what is method, what is science, and how you should relate theory and experience, and thinking about what is thought versus theory and consciousness, and all of this I think plays into this marshaling of these very heavy resources to address what Cassirer thinks is a really fundamental problem, which is how should we consider something which is very different in our experience, which is organic life, and also how does that relate to man? So, and this is all towards this what I call, or what people have called, Cassirer's anthropological turn. And I think that anthropology is something that links all of this in terms of why is there this focus, why is there this critique, and why is there this all of a sudden this when you decide to do something different, you kind of have to invent a tradition. So this is why Goethe comes in, Schiller comes in, many others come in, and they're sort of, I think, critiqued a little bit. Obviously, Cassirer doesn't copy all of them and say I agree with everything, but I think he believes that all of this should be taken very seriously, and it's remarkable for a person of his position, because in a lot of post-war sort of Popper-infused philosophy, all of this metaphysics and inquiry into nature is considered by Popper and his students to be nonsense. So yeah, and I think that's important too. So I think this goes too into this account of this divide, right? This great divide, which began at Davos, is, I think, really overrepresented, and I think there's an issue with that too, where one can also think about Cassirer and Jonas, and I think in a very productive way.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, we will give you another round of applause now.